The dust rose in angry clouds around Deanna Langley's feet as her father's hired men dragged her trunk toward the edge of town, and she felt the weight of 200 judging eyes burning into her back like the merciless Arizona sun that had already begun its climb toward noon. It was June of 1878, and Fort Yuma, California sat baking at the edge of the Colorado River, a harsh outpost where mercy dried up faster than puddles after a storm. Deanna's throat burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall, not here, not in front of the congregation that had gathered to witness her shame. "Get on with it, then." Her father's voice cut through the morning air, cold and final as a gravestone epiching. Samuel Langley stood on the porch of his dry goods store, his arms crossed over his barrel chest, his face carved from the same unforgiving stone as the desert mountains that ringed their town. "You made your choice, girl. Now live with it." Deanna's fingers trembled as she clutched the small carpet bag that held what remained of her life. 22 years old, and everything she had known was being stripped away because she had dared to love Thomas Whitmore, the married banker's son who had whispered sweet promises in her ear for 6 months before his wife discovered them together. Not in sin, not in any act that would truly warrant such punishment, but simply talking, holding hands in the shadowed alley behind the church. It had been enough. Thomas had been forgiven, welcomed back into his wife's arms after a public apology. Deanna was being banished. "Papa, please," she whispered one final time, hating herself for the weakness but unable to stop the words. "I did nothing wrong. You brought shame on this family," he cut her off, his eyes flashing with something that might have been pain if he had allowed himself to feel it. "Your mother is beside herself. Your sisters cannot show their faces in town without hearing whispers. You will go to Tucson. Your Aunt Margaret will take you in, or you will make your own way. I do not care which." The stagecoach waited at the edge of town, its driver looking uncomfortable as he secured Deanna's trunk to the back. She had enough money for passage, barely, sewn into the hem of her dress by her younger sister Rose in the dark hours before dawn. Rose had cried, had begged their father to reconsider, but Samuel Langley's word was law in his household, and once his judgment was pronounced, it was as unchangeable as the course of the Colorado River. Deanna climbed into the coach, her spine straight despite the trembling in her legs. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not yet. Through the dusty window, she caught one last glimpse of her childhood home, the store where she had worked since she was tall enough to reach the counter, the streets she had walked every day of her life. Then the driver cracked his whip, and Fort Yuma disappeared behind a curtain of dust and bitter memory. The journey to Tucson would take days, with stops at various stations along the route. Deanna shared the coach with a traveling salesman who reeked of cheap whiskey, and a silent older woman who kept her face turned resolutely toward the window. No one spoke. The heat was oppressive, turning the inside of the coach into an oven that baked them slowly as the wheels churned over the rutted road. At the first station, a ramshackle building surrounded by corrals and a few scraggly trees, Deanna stepped down to stretch her legs and take some water. Her dress clung to her back, soaked through with perspiration, and her head pounded from the heat and the crying she had finally allowed herself once the town was out of sight. She stood in the thin shade of the station house, sipping lukewarm water from a tin cup, when she heard the horses. 3 riders came in fast, their mounts lathered and blowing. Cowboys, from the look of them, working men with sun-darkened skin and trail dust coating their clothes. They dismounted with the easy grace of men who spent more time in the saddle than on their feet, and Deanna found her eyes drawn to one of them despite herself. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard for every meal, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar beneath his wide-brimmed hat. When he removed that hat to wipe his brow, she saw a face that was more interesting than handsome, all sharp angles and sun-weathered lines, with eyes the color of whiskey held up to lamplight. He could not have been more than 26 or 27, she guessed, young but with the bearing of someone who had already seen more of life than most. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, and something passed between them, a spark of recognition that had nothing to do with actual acquaintance. He paused, his hat still in his hand, and Deanna felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. Then the station master called that the coach was ready to depart, and the moment shattered like glass. Diana climbed back into the coach, settling herself for the next leg of the journey. Through the window, she saw the tall cowboy speaking with his companions, gesturing toward the coach. But then they were moving again and the station fell away behind them. The land grew more brutal as they traveled, the vegetation more sparse, the heat more intense. They stopped again as the sun began its descent, pulling into a larger station that boasted a small inn where passengers could take a meal and rest before continuing. Deanna's funds were limited, but she could not bear the thought of spending another moment in the stifling coach without a proper break. The inn was crude but clean, with a dining room that served simple fare to travelers and the occasional drifter. Deanna took a seat at a small table near the window, ordering beans and cornbread that she picked at without much appetite. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, fear, and grief. What would Tucson hold for her? Would her Aunt Margaret truly take her in, or had her father simply told her that to ease his conscience? And even if Margaret did offer her shelter, what then? Deanna had no skills beyond keeping store, no prospects, no hope of marriage now that her reputation was ruined. "Pardon me, miss, but you look like you could use some company." Deanna looked up, startled, to find the tall cowboy from the station standing beside her table, his hat in his hands, his expression open and kind. Up close, she could see that his eyes were indeed golden brown, flecked with amber, and that there was a gentleness in them that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "I do not mean to intrude," he continued when she did not immediately respond. "It is just that you seem troubled, and I have always had a weakness for damsels in distress. Yates Anderson at your service." He gave a small bow, somehow managing to make the gesture seem natural rather than mocking. Despite everything, Deanna felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Deanna Langley. And I assure you, Mr. Anderson, I am no damsel in distress, merely a traveler on her way to Tucson." "Yates, please," he said, and there was something in his voice, a warmth that seemed to wrap around her like a blanket on a cold night. "And if you will forgive me saying so, Miss Langley, that is the saddest smile I have ever seen on such a pretty face. If you are not in distress, then I am a Philadelphia banker, and I can assure you I am nothing of the sort." Diana's smile faded. "You are very forward, Mr. Anderson." "Yates," he corrected gently. "And yes, I suppose I am. Comes from spending too much time with cattle and horses and not enough with polite society. But I meant no offense. Would you allow me to buy you a cup of coffee at least? No strings attached, just one traveler being kind to another." There was something about him, some quality she could not quite name, that made her want to say yes despite her better judgment. Perhaps it was the genuine concern in his eyes, or perhaps it was simply that she was so desperately lonely and frightened that any kindness seemed like a lifeline. Whatever the reason, Deanna found herself nodding. Yates settled into the chair across from her and signaled the server for coffee. When it arrived, strong and bitter but hot, he wrapped his hands around his own cup and studied her with those unsettling golden eyes. "So," he said quietly, "what drives a refined young lady like yourself to travel the territory alone? That is not common, especially not in these parts." Deanna considered lying, spinning some tale that would preserve what little dignity she had left. But something about Yates's steady gaze made her want to tell the truth, or at least a version of it. "I made a mistake," she said finally, staring down into her coffee as if it might hold answers. "I trusted someone I should not have, and now I am paying the price. My father has sent me away to live with an aunt I have not seen in 10 years. I do not know if she will even want me, but I have nowhere else to go." Yates was quiet for a moment, and when Deanna dared to look up, she saw anger flickering in his eyes. "Your father sent you away. What manner of man turns his own daughter out? The kind who values his reputation more than his child," Deanna said, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. "I am ruined, you see. Or so the good people of Fort Yuma have decided. Never mind that I did nothing truly wrong. Perception is everything in a small town, and I was perceived to have strayed from the narrow path." "Fort Yuma," Yates said, leaning back in his chair. "That is rough country, rough people sometimes too. I am sorry you were treated poorly, Miss Langley. No one deserves that." "Deanna," she said impulsively, "if I am to call you Yates, then you must call me Deanna." His smile transformed his face, lighting it from within. "Deanna," he repeated, as if testing the weight of her name on his tongue. "It suits you. Means heavenly in Latin, if I remember my schooling correctly, which I probably do not." Despite everything, Deanna laughed, a real laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside. "You know Latin?" "A little," Yates admitted with a self-deprecating grin. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She insisted all her sons learn their letters and a smattering of the classics. Most of it ran right out of my head like water through a sieve, but a few things stuck. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Yates said, and the past tense sent a pang through Deanna's chest. "She passed 5 years ago. Fever took her quick. My father followed her within the year. Could not live without her, I think. They were like that, the two of them. Never saw two people more devoted to each other." "I am sorry," Deanna said softly. "That must have been very difficult." Yates shrugged, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. "It was. Still is some days, but life goes on, does it not? We do what we must to survive, to keep moving forward." He paused, then added, "My crew and I are driving cattle north to Prescott. We stopped here to rest the herd and the men. We will be heading out tomorrow at dawn." Deanna felt an unexpected disappointment settle in her chest. Of course he was leaving. Why had she thought otherwise? They were ships passing in the night, two strangers who had shared a cup of coffee and a few moments of honest conversation. That was all. "I hope your drive goes well," she said, trying to keep her voice light. Yates studied her for another long moment, then seemed to come to some decision. "Deanna, I know we have only just met and you have no reason to trust me, but I am going to say something and I want you to really hear me. You do not have to go to Tucson. You do not have to throw yourself on the mercy of an aunt who may or may not want you. There are other options." Deanna's heart began to beat faster. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you could come with me. With us. My crew is short-handed as it is, and we could use someone to help with the camp cooking and mending. It is not glamorous work, but it pays fair and you would be treated with respect." "I would make sure of that." Deanna stared at him, wondering if she had heard correctly. "You are offering me a job, you do not even know me." "I know enough," Yates said firmly. "I know you have been treated unfairly. I know you have courage to sit here and face an uncertain future without falling apart. I know you have spirit, because I can see it in your eyes even when you are trying to hide it. That is enough for me. Your men would never accept a woman traveling with them. It would be improper. My men will do as I say, and I say you would be welcome. As for impropriety, well, I think you have already been judged unfairly on that account. What does it matter what anyone else thinks? Yates leaned forward, his expression intense. Look, I am not promising you riches or an easy time. It will be hard work, long days and rough living. But you will be free, Deanna. Free to make your own choices, free to prove that you are more than what your father or that town decided you were. Is that not worth something? It was worth everything. Deanna felt tears prick at her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of despair. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for a stranger? Yates's expression softened. Because someone should have done it for you before now. Because I hate seeing people crushed under the weight of other people's judgments. Because... He paused, seeming to struggle for words. Because from the moment I saw you at that first station, something in my gut told me you were someone worth knowing. I have learned to trust my instincts out here. They have kept me alive more than once. Diana's mind raced. Every practical thought told her this was madness. She did not know this man. Traveling with a cattle drive was dangerous, uncomfortable, and completely outside anything she had ever experienced. But when she thought of arriving in Tucson, of begging her aunt for shelter, of spending the rest of her life in the shadow of her disgrace, something in her rebelled. I would earn my keep, she heard herself say. I would not expect charity. Yates's smile returned, brilliant and warm. I would expect nothing less. And you swear your men will treat me with respect. On my mother's memory, Yates said solemnly. Anyone who causes you trouble will answer to me personally, and I can be very persuasive when I need to be. Deanna took a deep breath, feeling as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into unknown waters. Then I accept. When do we leave, Dawn? Yates said. Gather your things from the coach. I will speak with the driver about your trunk. You can bunk with the supply wagon tonight, and we will figure out more permanent arrangements once we are on the trail. As Deanna watched Yates stride out of the dining room to make arrangements, she felt something stirring in her chest that she had not felt since before the scandal broke. Hope. Fragile and tentative, but hope nonetheless. The next morning, Deanna found herself perched on the seat of a supply wagon driven by a grizzled old man named Chuck Patterson, who had regarded her with deep suspicion when Yates introduced them, but had grudgingly agreed to let her ride alongside him. Behind them, a herd of about 500 cattle lowed and shuffled, kicking up dust that coated everything within 50 yards. The other cowboys, 3 young men who looked barely old enough to shave, kept their distance, throwing curious glances her way but not speaking to her directly. Yates rode his horse alongside the wagon for the first few hours, pointing out landmarks and explaining the basics of cattle driving. We will make about 15 miles a day if we are lucky, he told her. The cattle need to graze and water regularly, so we cannot push them too hard. We have a long way to go, and we will lose money if too many of them arrive in poor condition. How long will the journey take? Deanna asked, shielding her eyes from the sun. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if we run into trouble. Whether stampedes, rustlers, there are 100 things that could slow us down. Yates's expression was serious. I will not lie to you, Deanna. This is not a pleasure trip. You will see things that will frighten you, experience hardships you have never imagined. If you want to change your mind, I can arrange for you to catch a coach from the next town we pass. Deanna shook her head firmly. I am not changing my mind. You offered me a chance to prove myself, and I intend to take it. Yates's smile was slow and approving. Good. I was hoping you would say that. As the days passed, Deanna fell into the rhythm of trail life. She woke before dawn to help Chuck prepare breakfast for the crew. Simple fare of bacon, beans and coffee so strong it could strip paint. She learned to mend torn shirts and pants by firelight, to recognize the signs of an approaching storm in the behavior of the cattle, to move with the rocking gait of the wagon without falling off. Her hands, once soft and white, became rough and calloused. Her skin, despite her best efforts to stay covered, darkened from the relentless sun. The three young cowboys eventually warmed to her. Their names were Billy, a fresh-faced kid from Missouri who could not have been more than 19, Sam, slightly older and more serious, and Red, so named for his shock of copper-colored hair. They treated her like a little sister, teasing her good-naturedly but always with respect, and Diana found herself laughing more than she had in months. But it was Yates who occupied most of her thoughts. He worked harder than any of his men, always the first up and the last to bed, checking on the herd throughout the night to guard against predators and stampedes. He had a gift with animals, she noticed, a calm patience that settled even the most nervous cattle. He was also unfailingly kind to her, checking in regularly to make sure she was managing, bringing her extra water during the hottest parts of the day, sitting with her by the fire in the evenings to talk about everything and nothing. Diana found herself looking forward to those evening conversations more than she wanted to admit. Yates was surprisingly well-read for a cowboy, able to discuss books and ideas with an intelligence that challenged her. But he also had a wry sense of humor and a talent for storytelling that kept her entertained for hours. He told her about his childhood on a small ranch in Texas, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the time he and his brothers had tried to break a wild Mustang and ended up chasing it across 3 counties. "We never did catch that horse," he said one night, his eyes distant with memory. "But we had one hell of an adventure trying. My mother was furious when we finally limped home, torn and bruised and covered in dirt. But I think my father was secretly proud. He always encouraged us to be bold, to reach for things that seemed impossible." "What happened to your brothers?" Diana asked. They were sitting a little apart from the others, close enough to the fire to see by its light but far enough for privacy. Yates's expression clouded. "Jack died at Gettysburg. He was the oldest, the one we all looked up to. Thomas made it through the war but caught a bullet from a road agent 3 years later over some woman who was not worth dying for. And Matthew, my youngest brother, he headed out to California to seek his fortune in the gold fields. I have not heard from him in 2 years. For all I know, he could be dead too, or rich as Croesus and living it up in San Francisco." "I am so sorry," Diana said, reaching out to touch his hand without thinking. "You have lost so much." Yates looked down at her hand on his, then slowly turned his palm up to lace his fingers through hers. The touch sent electricity racing up Diana's arm, and she knew she should pull away, but she could not bring herself to do it. "Everyone out here has lost something," Yates said quietly. "That is the price of living in the territories, but you also gain things you never expected. Freedom, purpose. A sense that you are building something new, something that matters." He looked directly into her eyes. "Sometimes you gain people who change everything." Diana's breath caught. "Yates." "I know," he said quickly. "I know it is too soon. I know you have been hurt, that you have no reason to trust any man after what you have been through. But Diana, I need you to know that I am not him. I am not Thomas Whitmore or any other man who would make you promises and then abandon you when things got difficult. When I commit to something, I see it through. When I care about someone, I do not walk away. You barely know me," Diana whispered, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I know you better than you think. I have watched you these past 2 weeks. I have seen how you push yourself even when you are exhausted, how you never complain even though I know every muscle in your body must ache. I have seen how you are kind to the men, how you make them laugh and boost their spirits even when your own must be low. I have seen your courage, your determination, your refusal to be broken by what has happened to you. Yates squeezed her hand gently. I know enough, Deanna. The question is, do you want to know more about me? Because if you do, I am here. I am not going anywhere. Deanna felt tears slip down her cheeks, but for once they were not tears of sadness. I am frightened, she admitted. I am frightened of caring again, of being hurt again. I am frightened too, Yates said with complete honesty. Terrified, actually. But I have learned that the things worth having are usually the things that scare us most. He released her hand and stood, offering her his. Come on, let me show you something. Deanna let him pull her to her feet, and he led her away from the camp, out into the darkness where the stars blazed overhead in a display that never failed to take her breath away. The night was cool after the heat of the day, and the sounds of the cattle settling for sleep mixed with the chirp of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Out here, Yates said, gesturing to the vast expanse of land around them, none of the old rules apply. No one cares who your father is or what you may or may not have done back in Fort Yuma. You can be anyone you want to be, Deanna. You can remake yourself into whatever you dream of becoming. And who do you dream of becoming? Deanna asked. Yates was quiet for a moment. I want to have my own ranch someday. Nothing huge, just enough land to run cattle and horses, to build a home that feels permanent. I want to stop wandering and put down roots somewhere beautiful, somewhere with water and grass and room to grow. And I want. He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. I want someone to share it with, not just anyone, but someone who understands what it is like to fight for every inch of happiness, someone who knows the value of things because they have had them taken away. He turned to face her fully, and in the starlight his eyes were luminous. I know I am getting ahead of myself. I know you need time, but Deanna, I want you to know that I am serious about this, about you. I am not playing games, and I am not going to disappear when things get hard. I am here, and I am staying. Deanna felt as if her entire world had narrowed to this moment, this man standing before her with his heart laid bare. She thought of Thomas, of his smooth words and his cowardly retreat when his wife discovered their attachment. She thought of her father, who had loved her but not enough to fight for her when it mattered. And then she looked at Yates, at this strong, honest man who had offered her a place when she had nowhere to go, who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, who was now offering her something infinitely more precious. Love me instead, Yates said, his voice rough with emotion. Whatever that other man made you feel, whatever he promised and did not deliver, let me show you something real. Let me prove that not all men are cowards or liars. Love me instead, Deanna, and I swear on everything I hold sacred that I will never leave you. Not for another woman, not because things get difficult, not for any reason that exists under heaven. The words hung in the air between them, a vow and a plea all at once. Diana felt the last of her resistance crumble, felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crack and fall. She had been so determined not to trust again, not to open herself up to pain. But standing here under the infinite stars with this extraordinary man, she realized that protecting herself meant cutting herself off from everything good and beautiful the world had to offer. I want to believe you, she said, her voice shaking. I want to trust you, but I am so afraid. Then be afraid, Yates said simply. Be afraid, but take the leap anyway. Let me catch you, Deanna. Let me show you what it feels like to be loved by someone who will not let you fall. And somehow, impossibly, she found herself nodding, found herself stepping forward into his arms. found herself tilting her face up as he bent his head down, their lips meeting in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened into something that felt like coming home after a long and exhausting journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" he asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "It is a maybe," Deanna said, but she was smiling too. "A strong maybe. Ask me again when we reach Prescott." "I will ask you every day until then if you like," Yates promised. "I will ask you every day for the rest of our lives if that is what it takes." They stood there in the darkness, holding each other, and Deanna felt something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten what it was like. She felt safe. She felt wanted. She felt like maybe, just maybe, her story was not ending but only just beginning. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of hard work and stolen moments. Yates was true to his word, treating Deanna with utmost respect in front of the crew but finding ways to be near her whenever possible. They talked for hours by the fire, shared quick touches when no one was looking, exchanged glances across the camp that spoke volumes without words. Deanna felt herself opening up like a flower to the sun, all the joy and lightness that had been crushed out of her slowly returning. The men noticed, of course. It would have been impossible not to. But rather than causing trouble, it seemed to raise everyone's spirits. Chuck, the old wagon driver, began gruffly offering Deanna advice about cooking and telling her stories about his long-dead wife. Billy, Sam, and Red started treating Yates with new respect, as if his ability to win Deanna's affection had somehow elevated him in their eyes. They were 10 days from Prescott when trouble found them. Deanna woke in the pre-dawn darkness to the sound of gunshots and shouting. She tumbled out of her bedroll in the supply wagon, her heart pounding, and peered out to see chaos. Men on horseback were riding through the herd, firing guns into the air and sending the cattle into a panicked stampede. "Rustlers, stay in the wagon," Yates shouted as he rode past, his face grim. "No matter what happens, stay hidden." But Deanna could not just hide while the men fought. She watched in horror as the rustlers, at least 6 of them, tried to cut out a portion of the herd and drive them away. Billy took a bullet in the shoulder and went down, his horse rearing in panic. Without thinking, Deanna jumped from the wagon and ran toward him, dodging between the milling cattle. "Billy!" She reached him just as Yates appeared on horseback, his gun drawn. "Get him to cover," Yates ordered, then wheeled his horse toward the rustlers. Deanna heard more shots, saw one of the thieves fall from his saddle, and then she was too busy trying to drag Billy back to the wagon to pay attention to anything else. The fight seemed to last hours but was probably only minutes. When the dust settled, 3 of the rustlers were dead, 2 had fled, and 1 was wounded and being held at gunpoint by Sam and Red. Billy's wound was not as bad as it had looked, the bullet having passed through the fleshy part of his shoulder without hitting bone or major vessels. Deanna bounded as best she could with torn strips of cloth, her hands shaking with delayed shock. Yates appeared beside the wagon, dismounting in one fluid motion. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, though none of it seemed to be his own. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands running over Deanna as if to verify she was whole. "I am fine," Deanna said. "Billy needs a doctor, but he will live." "You could have been killed," Yates said, and his voice was rough with fear and anger. "I told you to stay in the wagon and let Billy bleed out." Deanna shot back. "I could not do that." For a moment they stared at each other, then Yates pulled her into his arms with such force that the breath rushed out of her lungs. "Do not ever scare me like that again," he muttered into her hair. "I cannot lose you, Deanna, I cannot." "You will not," she promised, clinging to him. "I am here. I am all right." The wounded rustler gave them information in exchange for being turned over to the law rather than dealt with on the spot. There was a larger gang operating in the area, he claimed, and they had been targeting cattle drives all season. Yates sent Red riding hard to the nearest town to fetch the sheriff, while the rest of them limped on toward Prescott with their depleted but still valuable herd. The attack had shaken everyone, but it had also forged them into something more cohesive, more like a family. They looked out for each other with renewed vigilance, and Diana found herself included in that protective circle without question. She was no longer just the woman they tolerated, but one of them, proven in fire. When the buildings of Prescott finally appeared on the horizon, Diana felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that they had made it, sadness that the journey was ending, and anxiety about what would come next. She and Yates had grown closer over the weeks, but they had not spoken again about the future, about what might happen once the cattle were sold and the drive was over. Prescott in 1878 was a bustling town, the territorial capital of Arizona and a far cry from the harsh outpost of Fort Yuma. There were actual wooden buildings with glass windows, a courthouse, hotels, saloons, and even a few shops that catered to ladies. Yates arranged for the cattle to be held in pens at the edge of town and negotiated their sale with a local broker. The price was fair, enough that everyone would be paid well for their work. That evening, after they had all cleaned up and taken rooms at a modest hotel, Yates found Diana in the small parlor where she was sipping tea and trying to process the fact that she was back in civilization after a month on the trail. "Walk with me," he asked, offering his arm. Diana set down her teacup and took his arm, letting him lead her out into the warm evening air. They strolled down the main street, past buildings lit with lamplight and alive with the sounds of music and laughter. It felt surreal after the silence of the open range. "I sold the herd for a good price," Yates said as they walked. "Enough to pay the men handsomely and still have a significant sum left over." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Enough to buy some land and start building that ranch I told you about." Diana's heart began to beat faster. "That is wonderful, Yates. You have worked so hard for this." "I have," he agreed, "but it does not mean anything if I have to do it alone." He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Diana, I told you I would ask you again when we reached Prescott, so I am asking. Will you take a chance on me? Will you let me love you the way you deserve to be loved? Will you marry me and help me build a life out here in this wild, beautiful country?" Diana looked into his eyes, those warm, golden eyes that had been the first kind thing she saw after her world fell apart, and she knew her answer. She had known it, really, for weeks now. "Yes," she said, feeling tears of joy spill down her cheeks. "Yes, Yates, I will marry you." His whoop of joy made several passers-by stop and stare, but Yates did not seem to care. He picked Diana up and spun her around right there in the middle of the street, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that left her breathless and dizzy and more certain than ever that she had made the right choice. They were married 3 days later by a justice of the peace, with Chuck, Billy, Sam, and Red as witnesses. Diana wore a simple blue dress she bought from a shop on the main street, and Yates wore his best shirt and a new vest. It was nothing like the elaborate wedding she had once dreamed of as a girl, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. Chuck pulled Yates aside before the ceremony and had a quiet word with him that Diana could not hear, but when Yates returned to her side, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "He said my mother would have loved you," Yates told her. "Said she always wanted us boys to find women with backbone and heart. He thinks I have done well for myself." "You have done remarkably well," Diana teased, then grew serious. As have I. Better than I ever imagined. After the wedding, there was a small celebration at the hotel, nothing fancy but full of warmth and genuine happiness. Billy, his arm still in a sling, made a toast that was slightly slurred from the whiskey but heartfelt nonetheless. "To Yates and Deanna," he said, raising his glass. "May they have as many head of cattle as they have years of happiness together, and may their love be as enduring as the Arizona desert." "Hear, hear!" The others chorused, and Deanna felt her heart swell with affection for these rough, kind men who had become like brothers to her. That night, in a small room at the hotel, Deanna and Yates came together as husband and wife. There was nervousness on both sides, but also tenderness and patience. Yates was gentle with her, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. When they finally joined together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like two pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, talking in whispers about their plans and dreams. "I have been thinking about land up north," Yates said, idly running his fingers through Deanna's hair, which she had unpinned and now fell in dark waves around her shoulders. "Near Flagstaff, maybe. There is good grazing there, water from the mountain runoff, and it is beautiful country. Pine forests, meadows, real seasons instead of just hot and hotter." "It sounds wonderful," Deanna said, nestling closer to his warmth. "When do we go? Eager, are you?" Yates teased, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We will stay here a few more days to make sure Billy is healing properly and to finish up business. Then we will head north. I want to have a piece of land secured and at least the beginnings of a house built before winter comes." "A house," Deanna mused. "Our house." "It seems impossible that just 2 months ago I was being driven out of Fort Yuma with nothing but shame and a carpetbag. Now I have a husband, the promise of a home, and a future I actually want." "You have always had worth, Deanna," Yates said firmly. "Those people in Fort Yuma were too blind to see it, but it was always there. I am just grateful I was in the right place at the right time to recognize it." Deanna tilted her face up to kiss him, slow and sweet. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I do not think I have said that yet, not in so many words. But I do. I love you, Yates Anderson." "And I love you, Deanna Anderson," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I loved you from the moment I saw you standing in that station yard, looking lost and brave at the same time. I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond that, if there is any justice in the universe." They made love again, slower this time, exploring each other with hands and mouths and whispered words of devotion. And when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Diana felt utterly at peace for the first time in her adult life. The journey north to Flagstaff took another 2 weeks, but it was a completely different experience from the cattle drive. They traveled with a wagon full of supplies, just the two of them, taking their time and enjoying the changing landscape as they climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew cooler, the pines more prevalent, and Deanna felt as if she were entering an entirely new world. Yates found the perfect spot on a high plateau with a view that stretched for miles. There was a stream running through the property, fed by snowmelt from the mountains, and meadows lush with grass. It was everything he had described and more, and Deanna fell in love with it instantly. They lived in a tent that first month while Yates and a few hired men from Flagstaff began constructing a cabin. Deanna helped where she could, holding boards steady while they were nailed in place, cooking meals for the workers, making plans for where to put a garden and a hen house, and all the other things they would need for a proper homestead. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done on the cattle drive, but Deanna threw herself into it with enthusiasm. She was building something real, something that belonged to her and Yates together. Every nail driven, every board placed, was a declaration that she was claiming this life, this future, and no one could take it from her. As autumn arrived and the aspens turned gold against the dark green pines, the cabin began to take real shape. It was not large, just 3 rooms and a loft, but it was solidly built and would keep them warm through the winter. Yates bought a small herd of cattle to get started, along with 3 horses, a milk cow, and some chickens. Deanna planted a late garden that produced enough vegetables to see them through to winter if they were careful, and she began learning to preserve food the way the ranch wives in Flagstaff had taught her. By the time the first snow fell in late November, they were settled in and reasonably prepared. Deanna stood at the window of their cabin, watching the flakes drift down, and marveled at how much her life had changed in such a short time. 6 months ago, she had been utterly lost. Now she was found in every way that mattered. Yates came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How happy I am," Deanna said simply. "How grateful I am that you found me. How strange it is that the worst thing that ever happened to me led to the best thing that ever happened to me." "Not strange at all," Yates said. "That is how life works sometimes. The universe breaks us so that it can put us back together in better configurations." He turned her in his arms so he could see her face. "And speaking of configurations, I have been thinking. This cabin is nice, but it is going to feel pretty cramped in about 7 months or so." Diana looked at him blankly for a moment, then his words registered and her eyes went wide. 7 months. Yates, I have not said anything because I was not certain, but how did you? I am not certain, he admitted with a grin. But you have been queasy in the mornings for 2 weeks, and you fell asleep at the dinner table last night, which is not like you at all. And you have been even more beautiful than usual, if that is possible, with a sort of glow about you. His expression turned serious. Are you? Deanna realized she was crying and laughing at the same time. She had suspected for a week or so, but had been afraid to say anything, afraid to jinx it or to disappoint him if she was wrong. I think so, yes, I think I am carrying our child. Yates let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled her into a crushing embrace. A child, our child. Deanna, you have made me the happiest man alive. We made this child together, Deanna corrected, but she was grinning through her tears. Boy or girl, do you have a preference? Healthy, Yates said immediately. That is my only preference. Healthy and loved, which he or she will be beyond any doubt. As the winter deepened and the snow piled high around their cabin, Deanna and Yates drew closer together in every way. They talked long into the night about their hopes for their child, about how to expand the ranch, about the possibility of eventually starting a small school in the area for the few families that were scattered across the high country. They made love in front of the fire, warm and safe while the wind howled outside. They read to each other from the few books they owned, and Yates taught Deanna to play poker with dried beans for stakes. Christmas came, and though they were alone, it was the happiest holiday Deanna had ever known. Yates surprised her with a delicate silver locket he had bought on a trip to Flagstaff for supplies, and she gave him a heavy wool coat she had sewn in secret over several weeks. They cooked a special meal, sang carols slightly off-key, and thanked God for bringing them together. In the spring, as the snow melted and the meadows exploded with wildflowers, Diana's pregnancy became obvious. She moved more slowly now, her belly round and prominent, but she was gloriously healthy and happy. Yates treated her like spun glass, constantly fussing over her and trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work, which Diana found both endearing and exasperating. I am pregnant, not dying. she told him one day when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "I need to stay active or I will go mad from boredom." "You could go mad from overdoing it too," Yates countered, but he backed off, recognizing that she needed to feel useful. As Diana's due date approached in June, Yates arranged for a midwife from Flagstaff to come and stay with them. Her name was Mrs. Harriet Knowles, a capable woman in her 50s who had delivered hundreds of babies over her career. She examined Diana thoroughly and pronounced her in excellent health with a strong baby who would likely arrive right on schedule. Diana went into labor on a warm June evening, almost exactly a year after she had been banished from Fort Yuma. The pain was intense, more than she had anticipated despite Mrs. Knowles's warnings, but Yates stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her brow with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when she was sure she could not bear another moment. "You can do this," he told her as the contractions reached their peak. "You are the strongest person I know, Diana. You survived being cast out with nothing. You survived a cattle drive and a rustler attack. You can survive this, and on the other side, we will have our baby. Just hold on to me and do not let go." Diana held on with all her strength, and when their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry just after midnight, she felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly stopped her heart. Mrs. Knowles cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets, then placed him in Diana's arms. He was perfect. Tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect. He had Yates's dark hair and what Diana suspected would eventually be his golden eyes. When Yates reached out a tentative finger and the baby grabbed hold of it with a surprisingly strong grip, Diana saw tears running unashamedly down her husband's face. "He is beautiful," Yates whispered. "He is perfect. Diana, you are amazing. I cannot believe we made him." "We did," Diana said, smiling despite her exhaustion. "We made him together. What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months but never settled on one definitively. Now, looking down at their son, Yates said, "James. After your brother who died when he was young. And Anderson, of course. James Samuel Anderson, if you like the sound of that." Diana's brother James had died of scarlet fever when she was 8 years old, and though the pain of that loss had dulled over time, she had never forgotten him. Naming their son after him felt like honoring both the past and the future. "James Samuel Anderson," she repeated. "It is perfect, Mrs." Knowles stayed for a week to make sure both mother and baby were thriving, then departed with her fee and a promise to check on them when she passed through the area again. Diana settled into the rhythms of motherhood, learning to nurse, to soothe, to interpret her son's different cries. Yates was a devoted father from the start, walking the floor with James when he was fussy, changing his diapers without complaint, gazing at him with such open adoration that it made Diana's heart ache with happiness. The ranch prospered over the next few years. Word spread that Yates Anderson was an honest man who ran a clean operation, and he began getting contracts to supply beef to the army forts and the mining towns that were springing up all over the territory. He hired a few steady hands to help with the work, men who treated Diana with respect and doted on little James. When James was 2, Diana became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. She gave birth to a daughter in the spring of 1881, a tiny girl with Diana's dark eyes and delicate features. They named her Rose Margaret, after Diana's sister and her aunt in Tucson. Diana had written to Aunt Margaret shortly after her marriage, explaining what had happened and introducing her to Yates. Margaret had written back with warm congratulations and an invitation to visit, which Diana and Yates had taken her up on when James was 6 months old. It had been a healing trip, allowing Diana to reconnect with the last member of her family who had not turned her away. Margaret had even sent a carefully worded letter to Diana's father, letting him know that his daughter was well, happily married and prospering, though Samuel Langley had never responded. Diana tried not to let that hurt, but sometimes, in quiet moments, she wondered if he ever regretted his harshness. She hoped he did. She hoped he lay awake at night thinking about the daughter he had cast out and regretting that he would never know his grandchildren. But she did not dwell on it. Her life was too full of joy to waste time on bitterness. As the children grew, the ranch grew with them. Yates added more land, more cattle, and eventually began breeding horses as well, fine stock that was in high demand throughout the territory. Diana started that school she had dreamed of, teaching the children of the few families in the area in a small building Yates and his men constructed next to the house. It was a simple one-room schoolhouse, but it served its purpose and gave Diana an outlet for her intelligence and education. James grew into a sturdy boy with his father's love of animals and the outdoors. Rose was quieter, more bookish, but with a stubborn streak a mile wide that Diana recognized as coming straight from herself. They fought sometimes, as siblings did, but mostly they were inseparable, exploring the meadows and forests around their home with the confidence of children who knew they were loved and safe. In the summer of 1884, when Diana was 30 years old and Rose was 3, they received an unexpected visitor. A man rode up to the ranch on a dusty horse, asking if this was the Anderson place. When Yates confirmed that it was, the man handed him a letter and rode away without another word. The letter was from Diana's sister Rose, the one she had been named after. Their father had died 2 months earlier, the letter said, of a sudden apoplexy that gave him no time to make peace with anyone. Her mother was ill and not expected to live much longer. Rose thought Diana should know, even if she chose not to return for the funeral. Diana read the letter 3 times, trying to decide what she felt. Sadness, certainly, for the loss of her father despite everything. But also anger that he had been too stubborn to reach out, too proud to admit he had been wrong. In the end, she folded the letter carefully and put it away in her drawer of important papers. "Are you all right?" Yates asked, watching her face carefully. "I am," Diana said, and realized it was true. "I am sad for what might have been, for the relationship we never had. But I am also grateful in a strange way. If he had not cast me out, I never would have met you. I never would have had this life, these children, this happiness. So perhaps things worked out the way they were meant to." Yates pulled her into his arms and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she murmured. "I love our life. I would not change a single thing, not even the painful parts, because they led me here." "And here is exactly where you are meant to be," Yates said firmly. "With me, with our children, in this home we built together. Everything else is just noise." Diana's mother passed away that fall, and Rose wrote again to inform her. This time, the letter included a small package. Inside was their mother's wedding ring and a note in her mother's shaky handwriting. "I am sorry," it said simply. "I should have fought for you. I was a coward. Please forgive me and know that I loved you always." Diana cried over that note, mourning the mother she had lost long before her actual death. But she also felt a sense of closure, of the circle completing. She wore her mother's ring on a chain around her neck, close to her heart, a reminder of where she had come from and how far she had traveled. The years continued to roll by, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their family and ranch. In 1886, Diana gave birth to another son, whom they named Matthew after Yates's lost brother. The child was healthy and happy, with a smile that could light up a room. James, now 6, took his role as big brother seriously, helping Diana care for the baby and keeping Rose entertained when Diana was busy. The ranch was now one of the most successful in the territory. Yates had a reputation for fairness and honesty that made him sought after as a business partner. He was asked to serve on the territorial legislature, but he declined, preferring to stay close to home and family. "I am a rancher, not a politician," he told Diana. "Let other men argue in meeting halls. I will stick to what I know." In 1889, Diana received a final letter from Fort Yuma. It was from an elderly woman named Mrs. Harrington, who had been a friend of her mother's. The letter informed her that Thomas Whitmore, the man whose attentions had led to her banishment, had died of consumption. His wife had left him years earlier, unable to forgive his infidelity, and he had died alone and bitter. Mrs. Harrington thought Diana should know, though she was not sure why. Diana showed the letter to Yates, who read it without comment. "Do you feel anything?" he asked finally. "Vindication. Sadness? Relief?" Diana thought about it carefully. "Pity," she said at last. "I feel pity for him and for the life he wasted, but mostly I feel nothing. He was a chapter in my life that ended long ago. You are the story, Yates. You and our children and this life we have built. Everything else is just a footnote." Yates smiled and drew her close. "Have I told you lately that you are the wisest woman I know?" "Not in the last hour," Diana teased. "You must be slipping." They celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary in 1888 with a party that brought together all their neighbors and friends. The children ran wild through the meadows while the adults shared food and stories. Chuck, who was now truly ancient but still sharp as a tack, made another toast. "To Yates and Diana Anderson," he said, his voice quavering but strong. "I have known a lot of couples in my long life, but I have never seen two people more perfectly matched. May you have at least another 10 decades together, and may all your cattle prosper." "Hear, hear." Everyone chorused, and Diana found herself laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by the love and community that surrounded them. As the sun set that evening and the party wound down, Diana and Yates stood together watching their children play in the last light of day. James was 12 now, tall and gangly, already showing signs of the man he would become. Rose was 9, still all arms and legs but with a grace that suggested she would be a beauty. And Matthew, nearly 3, toddled around with the determination of a child who refused to be left out of anything. "Did you ever imagine this?" Diana asked quietly. "When you saw me at that station all those years ago, did you ever imagine we would end up here?" Yates was quiet for a long moment. "I imagined something," he said finally. "I did not know exactly what, but I felt it. A pull, a certainty that you were meant to be part of my life. I have never been a religious man, Diana, but I believe in fate. I believe some things are meant to be, and we were meant to be." Diana turned to look at him. This man who had saved her when she had no one else, who had loved her when she thought herself unlovable, who had given her a life beyond anything she had dreamed possible. He was older now, lines carved deep around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, his hair showing threads of silver. But he was still the same man who had offered her a place on his cattle drive, who had promised never to leave, who had kept that promise every single day since. "I love you," she said, not for the first time but with no less feeling than the first time she had spoken those words. "I love you with everything I am, everything I have, everything I will ever be." "And I love you," Yates replied, pulling her into his arms. "From that first moment to this one and every moment in between. You are my heart, Diana Anderson. You always have been, and you always will be." They stood there in the gathering dusk, holding each other while their children played and their friends cleaned up, and their cattle lowed in the distance. And Deanna thought about the girl she had been, the one who was banished for loving the wrong man, and she was grateful to her. Grateful that she had survived long enough to find the right man, the one who had said, "Love me instead, I'll never leave." And he had not left. Through good times and hard times, through 3 children and a decade of marriage, through everything life had thrown at them, Yates had stayed by her side. The years continued to unfold in their slow, steady way. James grew into a young man who took after his father in every way that mattered, honest and hardworking and kind. He began courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher when he was 18, a sensible girl named Emma who fit into the Anderson family like she had always been there. They married when James was 21, and within a year, Deanna became a grandmother to a squalling baby boy they named Yates, after his grandfather. Rose proved to be as stubborn and independent as Deanna had feared and hoped. She announced at 16 that she had no intention of marrying young, that she wanted to continue her education and perhaps become a teacher like her mother. Yates, who had always been soft where his daughter was concerned, agreed to send her to a normal school in California, though Deanna knew it pained him to see her go. Rose returned 2 years later with a teaching certificate and a serious young man named David in tow. They married shortly after, and Rose opened a school in Flagstaff that quickly became known as one of the best in the territory. Matthew took after both his parents in different ways. He had Yates's way with animals but Deanna's love of books and learning. He was the peacemaker of the family, the one who could smooth over any argument and make everyone laugh. When Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, Matthew was working as a veterinarian in Phoenix, tending to everything from ranch horses to the exotic animals brought in by the new zoo. Deanna and Yates grew old together in the home they had built, surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. They never became wealthy by big city standards, but they were rich in all the ways that mattered. They had land, family, community, and most importantly, they had each other. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1918, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were over 30 people now, children and grandchildren and in-laws, all of them connected by the love that Yates and Deanna had built from nothing. Someone suggested that Deanna tell the story of how she and Yates met, and though she had told it many times before, she agreed. She spoke of Fort Yuma and the banishment, of the fear and despair she had felt. She told them about the stagecoach and the station where she first saw Yates, about the cattle drive and the rustlers and the proposal under the stars. She talked about building the cabin and having James and all the years of hard work and joy that followed. By the time she finished, there was not a dry eye in the room. "The moral of the story," Deanna said, looking around at all the faces she loved, "is that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is actually the best thing in disguise. I was cast out in shame and disgrace, but that banishment led me to your grandfather. It led me to this life, to all of you. So never give up hope, even when things seem darkest. You never know what beautiful thing is waiting just around the corner." Yates, sitting beside her, took her hand and raised it to his lips. "And never underestimate the power of a good cowboy to sweep you off your feet," he added with a wink, and everyone laughed. As the party continued around them, Deanna leaned her head on Yates's shoulder and thought about the journey they had traveled together. 40 years since that moment in the station yard when their eyes first met. 40 years of love, laughter, tears, and triumph. 40 years of building something real and lasting. "You have any regrets?" Yates asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Deanna considered the question seriously. Did she regret the pain of her banishment, the loss of her family, the hard years of building the ranch from nothing. "Not one," she said finally. "Every moment, good and bad, brought us here. How could I regret any of it?" "That is what I thought," Yates said, sounding satisfied. "Though I have to admit, I do regret not kissing you that first day at the station. I wanted to, you know. Even then, before I knew you, I wanted to kiss you." Deanna laughed, the sound bright and young despite her 62 years. "You would have terrified me." "I was barely holding myself together as it was." "True," Yates acknowledged, "but I made up for it later, did I not?" "You did," Deanna agreed. "You certainly did." They lived another 10 years together, watching their family continue to grow and prosper. Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1928 at the age of 76, with Deanna holding his hand. His last words were, "I love you, and I told you I would never leave," which was both heartbreaking and perfect. Deanna lived another 5 years without him, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, but always missing the other half of her heart. She spent her time writing down the story of their life together, determined that future generations would know what they had built and how they had built it. She wrote about the injustice of her banishment, but also about the incredible grace of second chances. She wrote about love that endured through hardship, about the importance of keeping your word, about building a life based on honesty and respect and partnership. When Deanna passed away in 1933 at the age of 77, she was buried next to Yates on a hill, overlooking the ranch they had carved out of the wilderness. Her funeral was attended by over 100 people, all of them touched in some way by her kindness, her strength, her determination to build something good from the ashes of her old life. The ranch continued to operate, passed down through the family. James's grandson eventually took it over, modernizing it for the 20th century, but keeping the core values that Yates and Deanna had established. The cabin where they had lived was preserved as a historical site, and Deanna's writings were published in a small volume that became required reading in Arizona schools. But more than the land or the buildings or the words, what lasted was the story. The story of a woman who was banished for loving the wrong man, until a cowboy said, "Love me instead, I'll never leave." The story of two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who built something beautiful from nothing, who proved that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. It was a story told at family gatherings for generations, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope remained. That second chances existed. That sometimes, being cast out of one life was the only way to find your way into the life you were truly meant to live. And on quiet evenings at the ranch, when the sun set over the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, old-timers swore they could still feel the presence of Yates and Deanna Anderson. Not as ghosts, but as something more essential. As a reminder that true love never really dies, that it lives on in the land and the family, and the stories passed down through the years. They had promised to love each other until death, but their love had proven stronger even than that final parting. It lived on in every child born to the family, in every acre of land carefully tended, in every act of kindness and courage and determination. Yates had promised never to leave, and in a very real sense, he never did. Neither did Deanna. They remained, not as separate individuals, but as part of something larger. Part of the story of the West itself, of people who came to a wild and unforgiving land and carved out lives of meaning and purpose. Part of the great American narrative of second chances and new beginnings, of love that transforms and redeems. And if their story inspired even one person to believe that they too could overcome their past, could find love after heartbreak, could build something beautiful from ruins, Then Diana's writings had achieved their purpose. She had lived a life worth living, loved a man worth loving, and left a legacy worth remembering. The ranch stood as testimony to that legacy, thriving well into the 21st century. The mountains that had witnessed their courtship still stood sentinel over the land. The stream where their children had played still ran clear and cold. And somewhere in the whisper of the wind through the pines, in the lowing of cattle at sunset, in the laughter of children exploring the meadows, the love story of Yates and Diana Anderson continued. Because some stories never really end. They just transform, becoming part of the eternal narrative of human hope and resilience. The girl who was banished had found her way home, not to the place she had left, but to a home of her own making. The cowboy who had promised never to leave had kept that promise in every way that mattered. And together, they had proven that love, real love, the kind that sees you through the hardest times and celebrates the best ones, was not just possible but worth fighting for. Their graves on the hillside bore simple markers with their names, the dates of their births and deaths in one line. They built a life, a family, and a legacy of love. It was understated, perhaps, but it was true, and in the end, truth was all that mattered. The sun set over the Anderson ranch as it had set thousands of times before, painting the sky in those same shades of gold and crimson that Yates and Diana had loved so well. The cattle settled down for the night. The children, great-great-great-grandchildren of that original couple, finished their chores and headed inside for dinner. And somewhere, in that space between memory and eternity, two souls smiled at what they had wrought. They had taken nothing and made it into everything. They had taken heartbreak and transformed it into joy. They had taken a chance encounter at a dusty station and turned it into a love story for the ages. And that, in the end, was the truest magic of all. Not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, though there had been those too, but in the daily choice to love, to stay, to build something together despite all the reasons why it should not work. In showing up, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, and saying with actions as much as words, "I choose you. I will always choose you." Yates had said, "Love me instead. I'll never leave." And Diana had taken that leap of faith. And neither of them had ever regretted it, not for a single moment of their long and full lives. They had proven that sometimes the wrong man leading you astray was exactly what you needed to find the right man to lead you home. And they had lived happily ever after, in the truest and most complete sense of those words. Not because their life was easy or perfect, but because they faced it together, with love and courage and an unshakable commitment to each other and the life they were building. That was the story. That was the legacy. That was the happy ending they had earned through perseverance and faith, and the simple, profound decision to love each other well. And it was an ending that was also a beginning, continuing on through the generations. A testament to what was possible when two people found each other at exactly the right moment and chose to build something that would last forever.